Hello and welcome to Performance Bonus, presented by the Bum Rush. Performance Bonus is a part of the Cage Side Press Podcast Network. On this episode of Performance Bonus, we'll discuss the particulars of MMA from a business perspective. I'll do this with my co-host, Patrick Auger. Patrick, how are you?
Doing good. How about you?
I'm doing pretty good. All right, let's get into it. We got to talk about this UFC ESPN deal. I'm hearing about guarantees of payouts based on 500,000 buys on the pay-per-view side of things. Obviously, Brendan Schaub has come out and said that disincentivizes the UFC to build stars. The days of Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey and all these people are dead. So I want you to give me sort of your view of the UFC ESPN deal. I mean, by all accounts, it's been a success for the UFC. I'm not quite sure if it's been a success for ESPN yet. Am I wrong in thinking that 500,000 buys means that entities like the UFC no longer want to make money is silly? Like, what's your take on this? How do you interpret the UFC ESPN deal?
Yeah, so you're not wrong at that at all. Basically, what this deal does is it gives the UFC a security blanket. Essentially, up to 500,000 buys, something that they haven't been able to reproduce outside of stars like Conor McGregor, Ronda Rousey, John Jones. It essentially means that every pay-per-view that they put on, they're going to get the equivalent of 500,000 buys worth of money from ESPN. Now, if it goes beyond that, there is an unknown deal and split in terms of they certainly get a piece. UFC will get a piece of any pay-per-view buy beyond 500,000. But what that split is unknown. My guess is it's going to be probably 60-40 in ESPN's favor. Only reason being is because ESPN is paying that licensing fee. They're essentially allowing the UFC to put on whatever they want. And then if their pay-per-view falls short, they get no harm whatsoever done to them. I mean, so you're looking at UFC 238, right? A year ago, would a Marlon Moraes versus Cejudo title fight and a co-main of Jessica Ai and Valentina Shevchenko really headlined a fight or a pay-per-view card? I don't know. I really don't. Maybe, but it's something where they're allowed to do that now, and they don't have to worry about the cost because ESPN has them covered.
All right, Patrick, let's talk about the long game, because when I watch ESPN now, I see UFC all over the place. They have a nice piece of real estate in the corner of my screen. Whatever's coming up next in the UFC is pretty, I don't want to say permanently there, but I see it a lot. Whatever the next UFC pay-per-view is, whatever the next UFC event is. So the long game for ESPN and UFC, is ESPN in bed with UFC to bolster its ESPN Plus subscribers? Is it in bed with ESPN for just because they're in this game now where they're buying television rights and there's only so much that you can buy, and ESPN maybe a little bit may give them more bang for their buck in terms of the money they would spend on the NFL or Major League Baseball, or like this is kind of a Cadillac brand in the UFC, and they're getting a lot for, I don't want to say a little, but less than they would pay for the NFL or whatever. What do you think the long game is for both of these? And I mean, I would say UFC wants to be with ESPN for the foreseeable future, right? Forever.
Right.
So what's in it for ESPN?
So for ESPN, I mean, they've been hemorrhaging subscribers from their regular network television now for a while. I mean, they're down to 86 million, I believe down 11 million in the past year. I mean, they're bleeding. And they know they have to make that switch over to streaming. They see it. The writing's on the wall. You've had layoffs back in 2017, layoffs back in 2015 of several ESPN employees. They're still the worldwide leader in sports, but they're not, this mammoth giant that's growing and growing. They're bleeding, and they need to make that transition. Especially Disney sees this, and Disney owns ESPN. So you've got Disney coming out with Disney Plus, their streaming service. It's going to be bundled with ESPN Plus and Hulu, who was also recently bought. So you're going to get this, hey, buy all three for $20 a month, $25 a month, whatever they come up with. And for ESPN right now, while they're in that initial transition phase, they need to boost that subscriber count to make it worthwhile. I mean, what else does ESPN Plus have besides the UFC? You've got some soccer games, you've got the occasional baseball game that's out of market, and you've got, sports that are less covered. But with the UFC, they got a huge boost in subscribers. I think they basically doubled what they had once they did Cejudo versus Dillashaw. And they're counting on at least keeping those numbers up there or growing it to a substantial amount that will say, hey, it's worth your money to get this bundle with Disney Plus and Hulu, or just buy ESPN Plus in general. So ESPN sees the UFC as a way to kind of force people into their streaming service, and the UFC sees it as a way to get guaranteed revenue so that they no longer have that pressure of building stars. Before, like you said, there's this whole like, stars are dead, all that. That's not true at all. But before, the UFC had a certain amount of pressure to build those stars, because if they didn't, well, they lost money. I mean, if you had, a pay-per-view that did 125,000 buys, like Nunes versus, what was that? Nunes versus Pennington, I think did around 125,000 buys, or maybe even less. I mean, that ends up really hurting the UFC's long-term financial plan. Now they don't have to worry about that. If they build stars, great. They get a cut. They still have money. They're going to be gaining more money from that. But if they don't, well, that's okay too, because they have a locked-in deal for 7 years that gives them a huge cash inflow and allows them to do whatever they want with it.
One of the interesting things that come out of this is some of these little ancillary things that happen based on it. For example, they seem to really be pushing Cejudo, and I find that interesting because and I want to talk about the PFL here in a second. I was going to wait till later to bring them in, but I think because of their relationship with ESPN, it's important. But when I see them pushing a guy like Cejudo on ESPN, it makes sense. I mean, he's a gold medal winner, and this is what casual fans respond to. They can sort of tie in the Olympics. And so I find it interesting, again, in the way the certain things that they're sort of building this brand and who they're choosing to highlight and all that. Okay, so we'll get to Fight Pass down the road, a different podcast, because I think that's going to maybe be a casualty of this ESPN Plus deal in the way that ESPN Plus is sort of the place where you can only see 30 for 30s now. A lot of the catalog might end up on ESPN. And I don't know how I feel about that, but again, that's a podcast for another day. Let's talk about PFL. Because when I look at the PFL on ESPN, it makes a lot more sense to me as far as a template goes. Like for casual sports fans, you have playoffs. PFL is as stats-driven of a mixed martial arts promotion as I've ever seen. I mean, they got a guy getting hit, and you see the punches right away on the stats. I just think that the way that they're built is built for sports fans. I went to go see a UFC a couple of weeks ago with some buddies, and as I'm watching the PFL, I'm seeing they have Dominic Cruz and Gilbert Melendez doing their Unlocking Victory show. Like, all this is sort of interspliced, Patrick. So I don't know that the casual fan really can draw hard lines between the UFC and the PFL right now. They probably think it's all MMA. So how does that benefit? Do you think the big winner in this is the PFL?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they went from being their viewership is still terrible. I mean, their viewership is still around 140,000 viewers. Like, I mean, I want to compare that to the last ESPN show that UFC did. We're talking, closer to 1 million or 800 and some thousand. I mean, for the PFL, they essentially got an offer from ESPN that said, hey, here's millions of dollars for you to have an exclusive agreement with us. We'll show your content as well as give you some ESPN Plus, behind the scenes stuff. And we'll put you right next to the UFC, where, again, you have all the casual fans saying, oh, look, it's MMA, it's MMA. I mean, this is huge exposure for the PFL at almost none of the cost. It's also playing into ESPN's whole, carving out a niche in combat sports. They want to take over as much of that as they can. That's why you've got boxing on there as well. I mean, Top Rank, they are trying to build their name in combat sports to help transition to ESPN Plus. PFL just got picked up because they needed more content. So the PFL ends up with a huge amount more of viewers than they would have had on NBCSN. I mean, I don't know how many people watch NBCSN, but I know that a lot more people have ESPN2 on their homes and on at bars. So they're getting way more exposure for almost nothing. And the UFC just has to sit there and take it because that's their, bread and butter now. They have to essentially say, well, I don't know that they necessarily complained or if they even care, but it's more of a loss to them because if casual fans pick up on that PFL format and like it more, that's going to hurt UFC more in the long run.
Yeah, it's going to be tricky because one thing that ESPN held out on for a while on was production, right? And they've really done a pretty good job of keeping the production for a while. That was a sticking point in a lot of deals in the past. I think it was a sticking point with ESPN in the past, where they were thinking about doing a deal, and it was like, no, we like to do our own production. We have our own guys behind mics, and I respect that. Let me ask you this. And I proposed this a couple of weeks ago on a different podcast. I feel like the way this is all heading, and if I'm sort of reading the tea leaves or whatever, I think that the end game here is that the PFL becomes a feeder league for the UFC, and that because ESPN obviously has more leverage with the PFL than they do with the UFC, because UFC is more, they can go out into the marketplace and find a suitor, maybe not a suitor the caliber of ESPN, but they can find a suitor. PFL, they're lucky to be with ESPN, right? So my thought would be if you win the PFL tournament, you get the $1 million and you get a UFC contract, and then then it makes sense that they're on the same channel. Now they're no longer necessarily competitors. They work together. And it is a way for the UFC to sort of bring about talent. Justin Gaethje so if you make the connection between the World Series of Fighting and the PFL, Justin Gaethje, Marlon Moraes. So I just think there's a lot more, guys leave the UFC, go to Bellator, don't come back. Guys leave the UFC, go to World Series of Fighting, they come back and come back stronger. So they kind of have not been necessarily friends in the past, but they certainly haven't been foes. So what are your thoughts on that? And do you think that ESPN would go for that? Do you think UFC would go for that? Obviously, PFL would go for that. What do you think?
I think it's going to come down to what casual viewers especially respond to more. I mean, if you get more casual viewers liking that playoff format, liking the regular season, I would be surprised if PFL would take that deal. Because, to them, like you said, ESPN has a lot more leverage over the PFL. PFL is lucky to be there. If they start noticing an uptick in viewership for PFL fights, if they start noticing a lot more money coming in on that side, I mean, right now they get to just sit back and watch. They say, hey, we have 2 combat sports brands. Which one is making us more money? If PFL ends up generating those ratings and doing better, they're going to throw more money behind it. They're going to throw more advertising behind it. You're going to see a lot more of that. Right now, they've put a ton of marketing push into the UFC. They're just waiting. They have both properties now. They're just going to sit back and wait. If PFL does well, they're going to try and push it. And I think, if anything, they'll try and push the UFC out, or at least renegotiate a better deal when the 7 years is up. Because like we've talked about, with pay-per-views, outside of those big-name stars, pay-per-views are going to be way less than 500,000 buys if recent history is anything of an indicator. So they're going to try and use the PFL's increase in viewership as a leverage marker there. If PFL ends up staying stagnant or doesn't go that well, starts hemorrhaging, but they still want to keep the content, then I think you see something negotiated similar to what you're talking about. If PFL starts dying or isn't, giving them the numbers they want, ESPN will probably push for something like that because it connects the two, builds it into a singular brand, and keeps money in ESPN's pocket. But right now, ESPN's sitting pretty. They get to sit back and watch and see which does better.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on to fighter pay. One of those taboo subjects to talk about, along with religion and what goes on in the bedroom, is someone's pay. A couple months ago, Greg Hardy and Andre Arlovsky were paid $150,000 and $300,000, respectively, at UFC Fort Lauderdale for not overly impressive performances. Now, we know that people are paid based on their ability to convince at least 2 people of their worth. People being overpaid and underpaid has existed since the beginning of time. I don't want to ask you, should we expect the UFC to be any different? I mean, obviously guys are going to get paid. Arlovsky getting paid that kind of money is based on time and service, if you will, time in the UFC. Hardy being paid that money is based on keeping away from competitors. I understand that. But how does the UFC reconcile fighter pay when there's such a disparity between – do they just sort of turn a blind eye to it? Like, what do you think the solution is for fighter pay? And in asking that, I want to kind of separate that a little bit from the union. I want to talk to you about, because we'll get to the union and all that. I want to talk to you about how does the UFC handle fighter pay moving forward? First of all, do you think it's a problem?
So it depends on which side you're looking at it. If you're the UFC, it's not a problem at all. If you're the UFC, that's how they've done business in the past. That's how they'll continue to do business until someone stops them. I mean, their whole goal part of what they said in their 2015 filing and the documents that came out regarding their sale to Endeavor, they're all about a cost-cutting strategy. And employees are costs. And, there's so much you can tone down in production. I think that's a big reason that they wanted to keep production, like you were talking about, is my guess is they would have had to give up a certain amount of pay if ESPN took that over. But with, in terms of actually producing, there's only so much you can cut. Then you start cutting fighters. Then you start looking at salaries. And really, for them, they've always been an organization where you've got guys that come in and, have the old pride contracts of Mark Hunt making $800,000 per fight, or Alistair Overeem getting more money than Stipe Miocic when Miocic is the defending champion. That's just how they roll. They want to get as little money for the fighter as possible so they can keep more in their pockets. That's what they do. So if you're looking at it from the business side, they're happy with it. They want to drive those costs down. I think part of the reason they're pushing guys like Cejudo is because right now Cejudo's not making nearly as much money as some of the other fighters. Some of the bigger name guys, you talk about Conor and any of those superstars, that's kind of an outlier. It's harder to gauge, but they want to push fighters whose salaries are lower. They want to reduce fighter pay overall. If you're the fighters, it's a massive problem. I mean, there is no rhyme or reason to how the UFC decides who is a market mover and who's not. And unless you have a manager who's really good at negotiating for you, you might get stuck with, a 20,000 show, 20,000 win if you're not champion. And that's the type of thing that, I think it was Dillashaw who lost his belt. And then when he fought a Sun Tzu was down to, 70 grand total for a show and win, something like that. I mean, that's the type of thing where if you're a fighter, you're shooting in the dark. If you ask too much, they might cut you and say, no, we're not taking it. Go test free agency. You ask too little, they'll gladly tell you, but you have no, benchmarker to go against.
So is this where guys like Ali Abdelaziz gain all their power because they, get these relationships both with media entities? Obviously his relationship with Ariel Helwani is soured as of recently, if that's what we'll call a shoot, in the wrestling parlance. So, yeah, a guy like Ali has all these relationships and seems to work well with the UFC. It to a point where now he's have got guys that he represents potentially fighting each other. So he kind of wins either way. So if you're a fighter, and again, we'll get to the union stuff in a second, how do you kind of to do this dance where it's like you want to get paid equitably, but you might not agree with some of the tactics? Do you just got to, sort of, because I've always said one of the things in MMA that makes the least sense to me, that I find the hardest time reconciling, is all the things I hear about Ali Abdelaziz and the quality of guys who are represented by him. So it's sort of like just, I guess, making a deal with the devil. Like I've met Frankie Edgar. I've met all these guys who vouch for Ali. I've met Ali, and he was nice to me. I covered him in World Series of Fighting. He seemed like a nice guy to me, but you hear all this other stuff, and you see some of the tactics, and you see some of the things he gets into. If you're a fighter, I mean, are you just got to kind of sign a deal with the devil, or is there another path, or is the path going to ultimately be unionization?
I mean, ultimately, yes, the path is unionization. That's the only way you can be, secure in your pay. You know what you're getting. You have a clear voice. Everything is out on the table, transparent. That's the only way you get there. Outside of that, it's either making a deal with the devil, like Ali, and I know exactly what you're talking about. Seems like a nice dude. I met him once. Seems very nice. Had fighters vouch for him, but then you hear all this other stuff, and it's hard to reconcile all that. Other than that, the only other way besides those two that I can think of off the top of my head that used to work and may be harder now that ESPN and UFC have this shored up deal together is essentially make a bunch of noise outside of the cage as a fighter. If you win the public, the UFC or a major promotion is going to want to keep you. I mean, big part of the reason they're paying Greg Hardy as much as they are is he's not well liked. A lot of people want to see him get beat up, but he has a name for himself outside of the cage, and has that presence where he's done things to make the public either love him or hate him. And that draws the UFC and other businesses to look at him and say, people are going to watch, so we will pay you more. That's the only other avenue a fighter has right now. Ultimately, again, unionization is the best course of action, but right now it's either manager or make a lot of noise outside the cage.
Yeah, I agree. And even that, though, I mean, I agree with you about making a lot of noise out of the cage, but look how they put Kobe Covington on ice. You know what I mean? Like, this is a guy who completely created a scenario for himself. Won the fight that he was supposed to win to then get the shot, and then they just, like, 1 minute Dana White's taking him to the White House, next minute he wants nothing to do with the guy. So, and I think that is more a message to other fighters than it is with his true feelings about Kobe Covington. I thought initially when it happened, I was like, well, maybe Dana's trying to pit himself against Kobe to make Kobe even more. But then it was kind of counterintuitive to what Kobe was trying to do. Like, Kobe was trying to get fans to dislike him, and then Dana made him a sympathetic figure. Like, it just didn't make sense if that was premeditated on Dana's part. So I don't know, man. I'm with you. And I want to get to one other thing, and then we'll get to unionization, because it seems to be the elephant in the room on this situation. All right. Speaking of revenue streams and other things that may help fighters make some money, one that was taken away from fighters was apparel endorsements. I say that only because the Reebok deal has handcuffed most fighters in terms of T-shirt and short advertising money. Patrick, why do you think more guys have not figured out a way to pivot to outside of the cage apparel or training apparel? Or, like, I guess my question is that if you are an apparel company, whatever apparel company, what are you looking for? You're looking for good-looking guys who are in shape to model for your apparel companies. So why have some of these guys who are in the UFC who are good-looking guys and, in good shape, like Luke Rockhold has done some stuff, but not on a large scale. All these guys, I think, why not just create a apparel company yourself, a T-shirt company, model it yourself? Like, I don't know. What am I missing? Do you think that it's not as easy as I'm saying it is? Do you think that there's not a demand for it? Why do you think these guys haven't figured out a way to sort of replace Tap Out and Affliction and all these brands that just the public didn't like anymore because of aesthetics? Replace that with something that's more current.
So I think the reasons are twofold. One, the exact specifications of the Reebok deal in terms of what a fighter can or cannot wear. Are there provisions in there that say you can't start your own apparel company, or if you can, there are certain limits on it? My guess is those deals are a lot more restricting than people realize. I would imagine somewhere in a fighter's contract there's something listed along the lines of company compliance, a vague statement that essentially says, company compliance with apparel guidelines, et cetera, that gives the UFC power to designate what is okay and what is not. And that brings me to the second part, backlash. I mean, the most recent example I can think of off the top of my head for something like that is when Fabricio Verdum, photoshopped that picture of him in a Nike jersey during a walkout, and got a huge bunch of backlash about it. I don't know if that was the main reason he was pulled off UFC TV for his analyst role. This was before he popped. But I know he was pulled for a little bit, and I know that there was a lot of internal rumbling and a lot of internal issues regarding that. And my guess is that it's one of those things where they make him sign the contract, and then they say, like, hey, if you go out and try and compete with one of our main sponsors or one of our partners, you're going to get matched up with guys that maybe aren't a good fit for you. You might not get a title shot depending on how many win streaks you're on. I mean, with this type of control the UFC has, they can easily pressure people to not go out and do, create apparel brands that might be way more successful and may actually, compete against Reebok for fighter clothing and fighter apparel. It comes back to, we don't know what's all behind the curtain, so we can't really do anything more than speculate, but those would be my guesses.
Well, and I guess the other question is, what about your likeness do you own?
Right.
So if I'm wearing if Reebok is creating a walkout jersey or training apparel that says Dominic Cruz on it, and this is an interesting thing because I know Dominic Cruz does have some apparel, and I know a lot of other fighters do too. It just doesn't seem like there's enough of an effort. The funny thing about apparel for me is, for years I'd go to a UFC store and I would look at their apparel and I was like, I don't want to wear any of this stuff. And then I would look around and see some other stuff, go to MMA Warehouse or whatever, you'd see some cooler stuff. Or I never understood, and I'm sure maybe they tried, but I always wondered, why didn't the UFC just buy Roots of Fight and have Roots of Fight create all their stuff because everybody loves wearing Roots of Fight. I'm sure they probably made overtures to them, or maybe because you see like a little bit into what the UFC is doing has bled some UFC or some Roots of Fight inspired stuff. So yeah, you're right. There's probably some language in there that precludes fighters from, doing certain things like that. But it just seems like this sort of lost revenue stream. All right, let's get to Fighter Union because this is the big thing that everybody thinks is either going to be the future, going to change everything, or the UFC will suppress it forever. So real quick, just tell everybody where the Fighter Union stuff is at, what it has to do with the antitrust stuff, and just catch us up, and then I have an interesting proposition for you. So go ahead.
So right now, essentially, unionization and organized labor in MMA is dead. I mean, that's the easiest way to put it. Right now, it's at a complete standstill. Leslie Smith's complaint to the National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB, was thrown out. The appeal is seemingly denied, and it can go farther, but given that the current general counsel of the NLRB is someone who spent, a lot of his time union busting and has done some famous cases for the Ronald Reagan administration for union busting on air traffic controllers, there's little hope that they would look at that case, even if all the people signed their authorization cards for Project Spearhead. If they got enough authorization cards and then it went to the NLRB, there's little hope right now that it would ever get approved, especially with them deciding recently that Uber drivers are independent contractors, not employees. So with that being said, if that classification were to happen, that they were independent contractors, not employees, then they can't unionize. You can't do anything. I mean, you're essentially stuck. So they're waiting for the next 2 years, probably, 2 to 6, depending on what happens in general elections and that sort of thing. They're waiting for the next administration to try and make another effort again. But you're not going to hear about it for the next 2 years at least, I would imagine.
So here's where that gets interesting for me, because when you say that Uber drivers are independent contractors, not employees, and that hurts the case for the union, I do agree with that. Here's the one thing that I don't understand as it pertains to the UFC in using that comparison, is that you can drive for Uber and you can drive for Lyft. You can't fight for the UFC and fight for Bellator. So I guess my question is, how do the courts, how do the UFC, is that sort of where the antitrust thing comes in, where it says, okay, we're calling you independent contractors, but you are independent, but you're exclusive to us. Is there any other precedent for someone who is both independent and exclusive?
So that's where it gets a little bit tricky. With Uber, the reason why it's compared to UFC fighters is because, famously during the Obama administration, you had FedEx drivers come back and say, hey, we are employees, not independent contractors. They technically could do the same thing. You could drive for FedEx and UPS, but essentially we're locked into driving for one or the other. And that's where they were, basically said, no, you're employees. And they got back pay, they got benefits, the whole deal. The NLRB signaling that Uber drivers are independent contractors instead of employees kind of reverses that. Kind of says hey, in our eyes, this is pretty much the same thing, but we don't think, it's employees. We think it's independent contractors. So that's kind of a signal saying, sure, fighters, you may, end up meeting more of these criteria and we may let this pass, but we're kind of telling you, not so directly, that you will fail. Basically, even with that exclusivity contract that you're talking about, with fighters, it's a lot harder to argue that part, especially. But it's also one of those things where it's not necessarily, it's not an explicit thing. That was another big thing with throwing out Leslie Smith's complaint. They didn't explicitly say, hey, you're an independent contractor or you're an employee, but it kind of hinted that, hey, you are more of an independent contractor. The reason being is that if it goes to the courts and it gets, drug into all this, it will be a long, drawn-out process. It will cost a lot of money, and there's no surefire guarantee that the current administration will still be in charge by the time all of this happens. So they don't want to come out and say, hey, you're definitely a employee or you're definitely an independent contractor, because then if it gets overturned, it looks bad for them. It's a whole thing. So it's a lot of political moves being made that show, hey, if you want to pursue this, you certainly can. And it's very possible we could rule you guys as an employee, but we're kind of hinting towards you right now that that's very unlikely. And your case is going to have to be rock solid up and down. Whether or not it would end up actually, at this point, I guess it gets too hard to speculate further without getting into evidentiary hearing, all of that stuff, having the actual NLRB look at it. But the antitrust part is also more about the monospony. I hate that word. Basically, monopoly power of the UFC, and that's a completely separate thing. That's more about like, hey, exclusive. Again, you're talking about exclusive contracts instead of one-year contracts, all of that, and they're basically saying you have, in other terms, a monopoly. You essentially are the best guys out there. No one can compare to you. So what you're doing by holding fighters hostage like this and holding contracts is illegal. But the UFC's kind of gone away from that now. They did that early on. They just grabbed every fighter they could. They bought out rival promotions, all that. But now they're releasing all these fighters. They're basically saying, hey, you go fight for somebody else. That's cool. We want our brand, our style. And they've kind of insulated themselves enough that as this has gone on through the courts, they've kind of reversed their whole business model of we're buying every single fighter and every single promotion, and instead moved on to, no, we just want, the best, and we just want the most exciting. And so by the time that gets to a decision, the judge is going to be able to look at all that, and it's going to say, well, I don't know. So it gets bogged down in a lot of stuff that probably gets outside my purview, because, again, this is a lot of speculation. But I would say right now it's mostly political is what you're looking at.
So I have a person I'd like to nominate to lead the charge for the UFC's fighter union, and I think it's an interesting choice. I don't think Leslie Smith has the juice to do this. One, she's cut and she's now in Bellator, so I think you have to be a rostered UFC employee to really make the noise. And I want to get your thoughts on what you think about this person, Conor McGregor. And the reason why I say Conor McGregor is because Conor McGregor has the public. Conor McGregor has the money. Conor McGregor really doesn't seem overly interested in returning to the octagon, unless all the criteria are correct. So for me, I think that this could completely affect his legacy in terms of switching it from, losing to Mayweather, losing to Nurmagomedov. If I'm Conor, I come out tomorrow and I say, I'm not going back into a UFC cage until there's a union. And first of all, he has the money to stay away. Secondly, it opens the door for another Mayweather fight, which he's talked about doing. So I think that to me, he's the guy that makes the most sense. Now, what will he give up in doing so? Probably a good relationship with Dana White. Probably a spot in the UFC Hall of Fame, which he's certainly earned. Potentially another fight in the UFC. So when you weigh everything out, knowing Conor, as I'm sure you know him, in terms of his public persona and the way he's done things, does this make sense for Conor McGregor?
I would say it does not. The main reason being that it would have made all the sense in the world had he done that before the new ESPN deal. But now there's not enough incentive for the UFC to let that happen. I mean, when you talk about the relationship the UFC and Conor has had, it's always had sticking points to do with money. I mean, that's really what it's always broken down to. Is you had the media obligation issues, sure, but it's been about money and control. And for a while, Conor had leverage over the UFC. He basically knew, okay, I can run the show, I can run the shots because I'm making you more money than you've ever seen. And if I decide to stop fighting, or if I, decide to go somewhere else, you can't do anything about it. And at this point, the UFC now has this constant stream of revenue coming in that they're not going to just roll over for Conor because he wants, a percentage of the company, because he wants shares. They're not going to roll over for him because he's threatening to retire again and not come back to the octagon. For him, his whole persona has been about, I'm, this kind of maverick guy. I make the rules. I call the shots. I'm the best in the world. I can do this. And the UFC has kind of had to live with that. At this point, he doesn't have the leverage to pull that over on the UFC. He just doesn't. And so if Conor McGregor says, you know what, it's time to unionize, not going back into the octagon until it's done, the UFC is going to say, okay, well, have a nice life. Your whiskey business is doing great. See you later. It's exactly what it's exactly what Dana White said when Conor tweeted out again that he had retired. He said, bright kid, he's got a bunch of whiskey, he's doing fine, he'll be good. I mean, they do the same thing with unions. I think if he had done it before that happened, it might have put UFC in more of a bind, but at this point, nothing will stop the UFC from getting in the way of unionization, because if unionization happens now, that's where it undercuts a lot of things they promised ESPN, and that would cause a huge issue with them.
So the only way that the union happens is something like all the champions band together or something. I mean, something really that's kind of out there. I mean, is that the only hope for unionization, is that everybody walks out or strikes? Or, I mean, what is the only hope?
Really, the only hope is if you get a candidate like Andrew Yang or Bernie or somebody on that's far left gets into the presidency and appoints somebody to the NLRB that's going to say, no, they're definitely employees. And if that happens, if it goes through court and the NLRB essentially rules that fighters are employees, there's nothing the UFC can do to stop it. And that's the only real way it's going to get done.
Yeah, and in fairness to the UFC, I mean, I will give them this. You could say they're hiding behind these entities, but they have made good use of government entities to sort of keep them out of things they don't need to necessarily get involved in, right? They've and listen, if anybody from the UFC listens to this, do not take this the wrong way. I'm using the word hidden because it's just the word that makes the most sense. They've hidden behind commissions in terms of suspensions, and they've hidden behind USADA, and they've hidden behind the NLRB. So, I mean, they're good at using – now, how much dollars they put into the lobbies of those things, that's something else we could get into. But I think that they've done an effective job of saying, listen, my hands are tied here. The NLRB said they're independent contractors. That's how I'm going to treat them. USADA said they popped. That's how I'm going to treat them. They don't really have to take a stance on these things. They can just say, listen, this government agency said this. So from that perspective, I do sort of, can appreciate the dance they're doing. I don't necessarily agree with it, but they're not making a decision before they have to, if that makes sense.
Right. No, they are masterful at doing two things. One, making it seem like some of their decisions are, and like you said earlier, you had, Dana and Colby type deal where it says, what is Dana doing here? First to bring him to the White House, and then, now he's saying, oh, we're stripping the belt from him, all of this. I mean, they are masterful at hiding real business decisions behind that public face. That's what Dana White does best. He's very good at, oh, well, Dana said this, and that's why this is happening. Well, really, there were some discussions probably behind the scenes, and this is much more of a business power play. The second thing they're very masterful at is surrounding themselves with the right partners. They have so many connections and so many good partnerships and relationships that they insulate themselves, as you said. It's not on them to say, hey, you guys can't unionize, or no, you can't do this. Instead, they say, no, well, according to the NLRB, you can't. Well, according to USADA, you can't. That's out of our hands. That's what good partnerships do. And, we're not talking about if they're influencing those partnerships or how much money they're putting into lobbyists or any of that stuff. But they have good relationships with all of those entities. And it's going to be hard. There are things that can bust that up, or that can come in and just say, nope, too bad. But it's going to take a full-on administration change, or it's going to take essentially changing the law. The other thing they have to worry about a little bit is the senator from Oklahoma, House of Representative member from Oklahoma, who has introduced the expansion of the Ali Act into MMA. If that gets passed, that also just undoes almost everything they've done. And, that's that's something that he's been working on for quite some time, and he has made clear he's not going to let die. So how long they can stave off both, unionization and that is a real big factor, because then you're looking at either unions on one hand or Ali Act on the other, and both don't play well for the UFC.
Yeah, and the other thing I think that they do really well is as they've climbed the ladder in the financial and political worlds, they're good at chumming up with people, and they get to know, look, when Dana White went into Trump Taj Mahal, I think in the UFC in the 20s, and became friends with Donald Trump, he kept that relationship despite Trump going into business with affliction, and that paid dividends at the end when Trump got to the White House. Things like Dana White speaking at the RNC. When you see that, you're like, what the hell is he doing at the RNC? And then now you realize that maybe he was a little smarter than we thought he was. And the Fertitta brothers selling the UFC, they're billionaires now. So with being billionaires comes a different class of friends. They know a different type, so now their ability to sort of navigate the world, to think that they're not still willing to pick up the phone for Dana White, even though they're not necessarily connected to the UFC in the way they used to be, is crazy. Of course they'd pick up the phone for Dana White. I'm sure they know people they didn't know before they sold the UFC. So, they have a lot of, they're like an octopus with all the different ways that they get their arms moving and out there. So I think they do a really good job of that. And I think that if you think someone like Leslie Smith, God bless her for what she's trying to do, I don't know that she's bringing enough to the table to beat back this behemoth. All right, let's get out of here in a rush. I want to talk to you about 3 things really quick. Let's talk about Russia a little bit. And let's talk about anything that's not North America as a larger thing. I've long thought that part of the reason why the UFC is expanding globally is, one, to sort of, I don't want to say kill off the competition, I guess would be good. One, they want the reach to be able to get the fighters that are all over the world. And 2, they want to be able to deal with competitors. Do you think that there's anyone out there who really can compete with the UFC in terms of globally? I hear a lot of pretty big numbers, Patrick, from one championship. I hear a lot of crazy numbers from KSW. And we'll talk about those individual promotions' long-term health later. But do you think that there's anybody out there that really gives the UFC pause in going into certain countries, or that UFC just kind of goes where they want and they're not really too concerned about who's out there?
Honestly, no. I can't see anyone really giving them a fight on the global level, on the global scale. KSW is hard to, get. I would say a big comparison is, UFC went into Poland earlier this year, and sold it out and set the attendance record. And that's KSW's backyard. And they went in there and they did just fine. I have never seen Lucille Pudilova get so much love in my life for just being there. And fans were in attendance very early on for the whole thing. It wasn't like North American events where you get a bunch of people coming in on the main card or even the last 3 fights. It's basically 2 or 3 fights in, stadium is packed. They want to see every single fight there. The appetite is there for more than just KSW. Same thing goes for ONE, I believe. UFC is going over to China later this year. I think they're going to expand into Asia and keep, going into that market, especially once they see the returns on what they're getting out of China and some of the other markets. And they're going to compete just fine with ONE championship. ONE's numbers are unverified. Can't say whether it's real or not. But anyway, you look at it, they're big. They certainly are, especially in that area of the world. But they can't compete with the UFC. I mean, you can't tell me that if, John Jones goes and fights over in Singapore or in Jakarta, that it's not going to massively sell out. Now, they may have some political ties that keeps them out of those regions, and that's really what those smaller promotions can rely on, but it can't keep them out of their main hub or anything except their main hubs.
So here's the real question, though. So let's say 2 streets over from my house was a AAA baseball team, right? And we may go, my whole neighborhood, my whole area around here, we may go see that team every night. We might be in love with them, but if the Yankees come to town, we're all to play in that stadium, we're all going to that game, right? So I guess my question is it more about Meaning this, yes, KSW could do great, but if the UFC comes to Poland, of course fans are going to go there. My question is the UFC, does the UFC go to Poland or Singapore or parts of Europe or Russia to get fans to watch events that are not in their backyard? Meaning, are they going to Poland so that when UFC is in Anaheim, they're trying to get Polish fans to watch it?
Yes.
Which is it? Do you think they're trying to just spread the brand, or do you think they're trying to like make it so that fighters in that local area want to join the UFC? Like, what do you think the point of global expansion is?
I think the point is exactly what you said there, of getting people in Poland to go watch them in Anaheim. I mean, when they went to Russia, there were so many deals that were made that people did not talk about or just didn't really come up much about. They've got UFC TV now in Russia. It's just a dedicated channel to just nonstop UFC content. You've got all this brand and marketing collaboration with big name partners over here or over there. You've got a bunch of Russian fighters being signed. They're not doing so hot, as we've seen with some of them fighting recently, but you've got a bunch of Russian fighters signed so that, I know that guy. I want to see him compete. Got family and friends talking about it. It's all about getting their brand to be even bigger than it already is. Because, like you said, if the Yankees come to town, everybody's going to watch the Yankees. Love it or hate it. You're going to have people that go watch the Yankees to root for them and people that go to root against. Same thing's going to happen with the UFC. You're going to have people that go to see, like, is this really that great? Well, I'm going to go check it out. Oh, this isn't better than my KSW event or my one event. Well, okay. Doesn't matter. It's going to make the UFC more and more money. It's all about expanding their brand to the point where they are the major leagues of MMA. That's what they're trying to do.
All right, let's talk about this Endeavor going public stuff. This is, I don't want to say it's way out of my scope because I read your stuff and I got it. But what does it matter? Does it matter to the actual fan? Does it matter to the fighters? Is it only relevant to people who are either invested in the UFC or work for the UFC? What does going public, and one of the things I thought was interesting about the piece you wrote was that just because Endeavor goes public, the UFC will either be highlighted or hidden based on how well they're doing at the time. So it doesn't mean that we're going to get to see what Dana White makes in a year because Endeavor went public. So, or pay-per-view numbers or anything like that. They're gonna tout their wins, hide their losses, and that'll be how it is. Right. So, what does this? It seems like a big deal, but does it really matter in the grand scheme of things to most people affiliated with MMA?
It doesn't matter in the short term. In the long term, it could have big effects. And the reason I say that is because in the short term, they're going to consolidate their financial statements to report for Endeavor. So Endeavor owns Miss Universe, PBC, UFC, a bunch of other properties. You're not going to see the specific numbers unless they want to say, hey, well, UFC killed it, this month to try and get more investors to buy their stock. They're under no obligation to divulge this is exactly how much money Dana White makes. This is exactly what the pay-per-view buys are, anything like that, except in their formal statements to the SEC, which won't be made to the public. And even then, they don't have to be audited nearly as much as Endeavor's own consolidated statements are. So what you're looking at for the short term is nothing's really going to change. If anything, it's going to be harder to see pay-per-view numbers because of the ESPN deal, but you're not going to see Dana's salary, any of that stuff. In the long term, however, that's where things get a little bit more interesting. If Endeavor gets bought by several groups or certain entities that get board seats and then ends up changing the scope of how they want to run things, that will ultimately affect the UFC. Anything that happens with Endeavor is going to also trickle down to the UFC in some form or fashion. Now, Endeavor only owns 50.1% of the UFC, so that's important to note. It's not like they own the whole thing outright and they are at the whim of what happens with Endeavor, but they still have a controlling interest. If Endeavor runs into any other problems outside of the UFC, especially, you've got the Writers Guild of America already talking about doing a strike against them for going public for conflict of interest. They've got a couple other things that are popping up here and there. You could always see Endeavor either swapping out, the head of the UFC, Dana White, if it made sense to in order to bolster their overall image, or which would be a real game changer is if they had to sell out of the UFC, which could entirely be possible, especially down the line. They run into financial problems. If their stock tanks, if you hit a recession and it really affects them for whatever reason, very possible that they sell some of their shares back to either Zuffa or somebody else. And then you've got a whole new ownership of the UFC. So it makes a difference long term, but right now you're not going to notice almost anything.
Are more people either financially or I guess socially invested in a company when they go public or no? And I guess what I mean by that is Dana White still going to be Dana White? Is he still be calling women whatever one is talking like he talked to Loretta Hunt? Or does the Endeavor going public kind of tell that, are they kind of coming down to Dana and going, listen, man, you're sort of, you could be removed for some of your behavior, not necessarily just your financial success. Is that in any way affected by going public? Does it mean more eyes are on the company? What is that?
Yeah, it draws increased scrutiny for sure. If there's some major thing Dana does that gets a bunch of headlines, if he says something, terrible or, does something pretty outrageous that is all over the newspapers, then that can affect it, especially with, people selling off shares, doing all of that. But as long as he doesn't make headlines or doesn't make any headlines to the general public, he just stays in his MMA media, range, you're not going to really see any increased action. He's going to be able to do whatever he wants as long as he doesn't cause problems for Endeavor and their stock price. Right. And if he's making them lots of money, and even if he's saying stupid things and causing a whole bunch of issues, if the price is going up, they're not going to care. It's really going to come down to if you have people selling their shares because of some public scandal with Dana White, then he's going to get removed, or you're going to have a major shakeup.
Right.
But yeah.
I actually find, and we kind of complimented them earlier, and there's sort of, we'll talk about Trump for a second, only for this reason, because I'm going to compare him to Dana White for just a second. And whether you like Trump or you don't like Trump, he is a fantastic politician. And that's the thing that I think I'm fascinated by him for that reason. So when I say what I'm about to say about Dana White, I'm actually saying this as a compliment, even if it doesn't come off as one. That guy is about as effective at keeping things off him. He's about as Teflon as they come, because, there's been talk from his mother and Josh Thompson about like some Me Too stuff, with Ring Girls or this or that. And he just sort of has shook it off. There was the Eskimo Brothers stuff with Brendan Schaub. That sort of just went away. And it's like, because of the way he conducts himself at times, it makes me think, okay, it's inevitable that Dana's going to say something that's going to get him removed, right? But he seems to sort of just find a way to finesse himself out of it all. So I don't know. It's interesting to see how we move forward. All right, let me get you out of here on this. Let's talk about these promotions in terms of stocks. All right, so I'm going to give you some promotion names. And if I'm missing any, because that's a real short list that I have, just tell me if you own stock in this company, generally speaking, if you would buy it or you would sell it.
Okay.
The UFC.
Right now, I'd buy. There's too much guaranteed revenue coming in to not, especially with the way, like you said, Dana's been masterful at running it up to this point. The UFC turning it around the way they did when Zuffa bought the company to what they've done now, it's very hard not to buy because nothing has changed in that area. So I would buy that stock.
Bellator,
I'd cautiously buy. They've been making the right moves. Their tournaments have gotten some names involved in them. I had the pleasure of covering one of their events recently, Bellator 221. The way they're putting on production is cost-effective and smart. I think they've got a bright future. I don't know what their actual finances are, but I am cautiously buying them for now. I'd wait and see, though.
PFL,
I'm definitely buying, at least right now. I'm getting ready to sell. I might have a short out there. Might have a short out there in the future, and my hand's over the trigger. But, again, increased exposure, all these deals. They just signed a sponsorship with Geico. They've got Anheuser-Busch deal. I mean, they're signing sponsors left and right. They're getting investments from the right people, big names like The Rock and Kevin Hart. I mean, you got to go with it for now. We'll see what the actual numbers produce, but stock's on the rise.
It's interesting for me, and we'll get to the other promotions here in a second. So about PFL, man, it's like they seem to make all the right decisions in terms of like, I like their production, I like who they're associated with, I like, they cannot translate it into views, whereas and ratings and all that. Whereas the UFC consistently shoots itself in the foot in terms of the fans. And still comes out, I mean, they had the market early and they continue to have it. One championship.
Ooh, oh man. I would go with a very, very cautious sell on that one. And the reason I say that is they're definitely on the rise in terms of getting, names out there. They've signed Eddie Alvarez, Sage Northcutt, Demetrius Johnson. But then they've also done the one agent certification, which kind of shoots them in the foot for North American expansion and getting those big name managers over to one championship. Because you're not going to get Ali, you're not going to get Abe I always butcher his name. Kawhi, I believe it is. Whoever, John Jones' manager.
Right.
But a bunch of those guys aren't going to come over now. So they've kind of limited themselves to, hey, this is Asia. We're spouting all these numbers. We're putting on what looks like good events, but we can't really back it up with any financials. And, I mean, other than the financials that John Nash produced that just showed that they're bleeding money, I think they would be more of a buy if they let go of that certification program and they really got into North America and expanded. But right now, I just don't see it.
KSW.
Ooh. KSW, I'm going with a buy. If only just because of their quality of content at the moment. KSW 49 was significantly better than UFC Rochester. They've got a diehard fan base. They're doing some of these freak show fights, but there's nothing new there. They have a strong market hold, and they're, really just pleasing their fans. That you've got a good product. I believe in the product of KSW, so I give it a buy for right now.
Invicta.
Invicta. I don't know. I'm slight sell right now just because they are just a feeder league for the UFC. Like you said, Fight Pass I think is going to go the way of the dinosaur here eventually. If Invicta gets over to ESPN, that'd be a different scenario. But right now, they're not getting nearly as many eyes on it because a lot of people drop Fight Pass to pick up ESPN Plus instead. Their one-night tournament was great. I think if they do more stuff like that, they get more buzz about them, it could bring them back. But right now, they're struggling a bit, and most of their champions keep going to the UFC and getting called up short notice. So, yeah.
Lastly, would you invest in any kind of would you buy or sell EBI, Eddie Bravo's thing, Submission Underground, Chael's thing? Do you think there's any future in this submission stuff, or is it just kind of a place where like guys who get suspended go, or it's fun for the night, but it's not really something that's going to really take the world by storm?
I think I would. I don't see a huge growth potential for them, but more and more I keep seeing articles and reading about wrestlers in MMA. The wrestling community, especially with Ben Askren going over to wrestle Jordan Burroughs, those two communities are getting more and more mixed. You see more and more top wrestlers coming over to MMA, dominating, bringing their fans with them from NCAA and the Olympics. As that continues to grow, there's still always going to be a side of the wrestling fans that don't want to see the blood, they don't want to see the striking. They're going to want to stay away from that. EBI, Submission Underground, places like that is going to be able to showcase that. I think it's going to grow. I don't think it's going to become a big name. I don't think it's going to rival most, if any, MMA promotions, but there's certainly a market for it. And right now, as wrestling makes its transition to MMA more and more, it's going to get more popular.
I think that's interesting that you said that, because I would like to see guys like Jordan Burroughs or some of these other high-level wrestlers, maybe that becomes the gateway in a way to the UFC, because if you're Jordan Burroughs and you go to beat the streets and you go against Ben Askren. I mean, you're going in there in a world that you're heavily favored in. It's very it's your lane, right? And to me, if you were to go to the UFC, it's like I'm an HOV and now I'm trying to get off the next exit. I got to cut across 4 lanes to get to the UFC. But to go to EBI or Submission Underground, to me, it's just like I put my blinker on, I merge over one. I'm taking live bullets, but I'm not. So, I'm going in there with guys who probably can't out-wrestle me, but damn sure can catch me in something if I'm not careful. Jordan Burroughs could probably keep himself safe with some mid-level submission guys, some grapplers. I mean, obviously, if he goes in there with the highest level guys, they're going to be able to get him. But I like that as a nice little transition to see what these wrestlers have. From going to, instead of going to these lesser promotions, I like going to, I like Chael Sonnen and trying to figure out a way to get Jordan Burroughs in Submission Underground. I like that. All right, Patrick, I'll give you the final word. What's the financial thing in MMA that's on your mind right now? Is it something we've talked about already? Is there something kind of on the horizon that no one's talking about? What are you thinking about writing about? What are you thinking about in general?
So I think, we've already really covered the PFL stuff with Elias Theodoro getting released. I think that's a huge sign for the UFC kind of specializing in more action and fighters like him going to PFL where there's a set format. There's a set, here's how you get your money. It doesn't matter if you're boring, quote unquote. If you win, you'll be fine. The other thing that just popped up before we hopped on here that is going to be on my mind for a bit is Yoel Romero just won $27.4 million in settlement against his supplement company for a failed USADA test. So you are about to see a flood of lawsuits from anyone that's been popped by USADA for a contaminated supplement because, that sets a precedent for all of these supplement companies to have to either pay up, file bankruptcy, or flee, essentially. That's massive. $27 million is more money than Yoel Romero will ever make actually fighting in the UFC. Yeah. But that USADA test might have been his biggest payday yet. So I think that's going to be more front and center. I think you're going to see a ton of that stuff popping up. That's my biggest thing to keep an eye on right now.
All right, guys, there you have it. Patrick, go ahead and tell people where they can follow you, where they can read you, where all your stuff's at. Give them the plugs.
Yeah, so you can follow me at All Day Auger. It's AUGER like Auger. You can read my stuff at Sherdog.com, MMAsucker.com, TheBodyLock.com. Those are my main sites. Other than that, yeah, I'm All Day Auger on Twitter and Instagram, or you can find me on Facebook under Patrick Thomas. It's not hard to. But.
All right, guys, there you have it. Episode 2 of Performance Bonus is in the books. Thanks to my co-host, Patrick Auger. And remember to check out all of our podcasts on the Cage Side Press Podcast Network. Take it easy, guys. See you later.